Great. So welcome everyone tonight at this webinar of the this webinar. This webinar is organized by the Central European Research Institute for Art History in KEMKI, and I am a research fellow there. My name is Kristóf Nagy, and first of all, I give the floor for Dávid Fehér, the director of the institute, to introduce the institution and institute its research projects, and then thereafter I will introduce our speakers of today, and we can start the contextual part of the webinar. So thank you for joining us tonight, and Dávid, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Kristóf, and I'd also like to welcome you. It is a great pleasure and honor to welcome you in the Central European Research Institute for Art History, so the KEMKI's webinar. And my task is to briefly introduce our institution, which was founded in 2021 as a member institute of the Museum of Fine Arts, Budapest. And our institute incorporates 3 departments: Art Pool Art Research Center, which most of you already well know, the Archive and Documentation Center, and a 3rd new department, the Research Department. KEMKI initiates and implements long-term research projects focusing on 20th century and contemporary art of East Central Europe based on regional and international cooperation. This is our ambition, and this is our these are our main plans. Our Archive and Documentation Center, formed of the former archival departments of the Museum of Fine Arts and the Hungarian National Gallery, holds the largest archive of Hungarian art, predominantly manuscripts, documents, and archive photos from the 19th to the 21st century, including the complete archive of the former Lectorate of Fine and Applied Arts, that consists of documents of state commissions, exhibition juries, and further issues of the official institutional system of the Cold War Hungary, which can be the subject of many further research. ArtPool, which needs no long introduction, was founded in 1979 by György Galántai and Julia Klanicai as an underground initiative, and documents, collects, and catalyzes artistic projects that were beyond this official institutional system. It became one of the most important archives in the East Central European region for documents and works of new avant-garde artists and a wide range of experimental tendencies: artist books, artist stamps, mail art, visual portrait, conceptual art, and performance art. The collections of KEMKI thus enable us to provide a complex overview of the Hungarian art scene's different spheres and their international context. This event, organized by KEMKI, is part of our ongoing research into the art of the 1980s under the working title, The Years of Transition. This is one of our major long-term research projects, alongside another important project, Resonances, which is a very interesting regional research project based on regional cooperation between the between different institutions from the V4 countries, and it takes shape as a traveling conference series, and the next conference will take place next week in Prague, so it is a kind of advertisement of this project as well. And Resonances focuses on the phenomena of cultural transfer in the 1970s within and beyond East Central Europe. So this is another important project, but now I talk briefly about the Years of Transition, which is another very crucial project we started this year. As a first step in this research, this May, my colleagues Kristóf Nagy and Julius Huth organized a 2-day conference titled The Flowers of Transition, The Art of Hungary in the 1980s. The aim of our 1980s research is a comprehensive study of the decade's Hungarian visual arts, taking into account the correlations of culture and economic policy, as well as the international context and interconnections. The research focuses on studying the transformation of the institutional system of visual arts, the main artistic controversies and critical discourses of the decade, the emergence of new trends in painting and postmodern theories, the intermixing of experimental and underground trends and different artistic disciplines, as well as the regional and international relations of Hungarian art. We intend to make interviews with key figures of the decade and an in-depth study of art criticism of the 1980s. The latter projects aim to prepare a conclusive anthology of art criticism in the period. Kristóf and Julius are working on this hard, which will be the first publication that accompany the project and one of the first publications of KEMKI in general. As a later step, we intend to expand the focus of the research in a transnational way, analyzing the period's art scenes and artistic activities in a regional context. And today's talk, this evening's event is related to this research because the first Soros Art Center in the region was established in Budapest in the mid-1980s. Which makes Hungary a great place to begin unraveling the local, regional, and global implications of the artistic and ideological transformations in the last decades of the 20th century. Kristóf published a very influential and highly debated, very interesting essay about the Soros Art Center in Hungary. And yeah, the questions we can also read in the description of this panel are very, very important. How contemporary art and post-socialist transition come together? How did artistic trends relate to the political economic transformations in the Eastern Bloc? As we indicated in the description, this webinar aims to answer these questions by focusing on Octaviann Esanu's new volume, The Post-Socialist Contemporary, the Institutionalization of Artistic Practice in Eastern Europe after 1989, that came out with Manchester University Press in November 2021. So it is also a new and very, very important publication that somehow comes together well with the research of Kristóf, or we will see this evening how how do these two researches come together. By discussing Esanu's account of the role of the Soros Centers for Contemporary Art, which mushroomed in the ex-socialist countries throughout the world. The webinar offers not only a historical but also a critical angle to the ideological transfigurations of post-socialism. And I think it will be extremely interesting and highly timely conversation about these issues, which nowadays are also very, very important theme in many fields of the discourses. And I think it will be also a productive point of departure for many, many debates related to the institutional shifts in Hungarian and regional art scenes. And it will be a very interesting discussion that can be related to our new 1980s project as well. And I'm very, very much looking forward to this conversation. And thank you very, very much for being with us, all guests, especially the guests of the conversation, but all the people who are present. And I give back the floor to Kristóf. And once again, thank you very much for all of you being here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David, for the really nice introduction about the volume and about the research project and about the institution. Now I introduce the speakers of the webinar, and thereafter I also briefly explain the format of the event, and then we can turn towards the first question. So we have our first speaker, Octaviann Esanu, who is also the author of the volume, The Post-Socialist Contemporary, as it is mentioned. And he is also a founding director and curator of the American University of Beirut Art Gallery. And he is also a part of the international editorial collective of the ARTMargins print. And last but not least, it's an important point that in the mid-90s, he was a founding director and first curator of the Soros Center for Contemporary Art in Moldova. So I will have a specific question for Octavian about his personal experiences and about his self reflections on the 90s, because it is a question not really touched in the volume, but I think it could be a really exciting topic for all of us. We have also Sven Spieker, who teaches at the University of California and who is a co-founder of the working group Cultures of World Socialism. He is also a founding editor of ARTMargins and the author of the volume The Big Archive: Art from Bureaucracy, among others. We also have as a speaker Karolina Łabowicz-Dymanus, who is the head of Department of Art Documentation at the Institute of Art at the Polish Academy of Sciences, and she is also the author of a Polish volume about the Soros Centers of Contemporary Art that was published in 2016 under the title Synchronization of the Web: Soros Centers for Contemporary Art. And in this volume discussed 4 capitals: Warsaw, Kiev, Tallinn, and Budapest. And last but not least, we have also Angela Harutyunyan, who is an associate professor of art history, also at the American University of Beirut. And she's also an editor of the ARTMargins journal. And she is the author of the monograph, The Political Aesthetics of the Armenian Avant-Garde, that was published by Manchester University Press, exactly in the same book series in which Octaviann Esanu's book was published. This is the Rethinking Art History series. So thank you for being here today, and all of you. And we will have a more or less 1.5 hours long webinar in which I will raise 3 rounds of questions for our speakers and 1 question, as I mentioned, specifically to Octavian. And after these 3 rounds of questions, we will have time for Q&A. So if you have time, please keep it. And at the end of the webinar, we will definitely have time to open it up towards the audience, especially we have a really large and nice audience here. So I really hope that we will have also an exciting debate or Q&A, and I would really love to leave time for that, because I think that's an important part of any academic event. And now let me turn towards the first question, that is a question for our invited speakers. And I would like to ask you to briefly expand your opinion on the book, and what do you think, what are the book's most important points, or what are the book's most important novelties for you? And I would like to ask you to expand that, how the book contributes to literature on the art of the 1990s and 1980s. And yeah, what do you consider briefly the most important takeaways or the most important novelties of this volume? So who would you like to start it?
I would be happy to start.
Oh. Sven, please.
No, you go ahead, Angela.
Okay. Thank you, Kristóf, first of all, for inviting me to reflect on Octavian's very important contribution to a kind of critical historical understanding of the constitution of contemporary art. Maybe I would just mention a few points that are especially relevant for my work as well, that I've been also thinking through alone, but also along with Octavian, as colleagues, as comrades. So I'd like to stress that the book perhaps is not really a traditional art history, but a critical history of capitalist modernization in Eastern Europe through the Soros construction of contemporary art in the post-socialist period. So in a sense, you already see here a relationship between the processes of modernization and art as institution, wherein art is assumed to be completely subsumed under the dictates of neoliberal governmentality, of the market, etc. So rather than having kind of an autonomous or semi-autonomous function within these processes of post-socialist transition. The second important point for me about the book is that it counters the presentism that characterizes not only the epochal contemporaneity as a quality of historical time that is supposedly atemporal, but also it counters dominant theorizations of the art of the post-socialist condition in general, that are specifically, right, presentist as well. The very mode of theorization of contemporary art from a post-socialist perspective has been suffering from certain presentist tendencies. And finally, I mean, along with other characteristics that I will briefly mention as well, the book offers historicization into the condition of possibility for global contemporary art that would later on triumph as a result of the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the USSR, as a sort of a primal scene of art's unprecedented globalization that itself has been repressed in the dominant historiographies and critical theorizations of contemporary art that normally begin from a very, Western perspective, unlike those dominant theorizations. And I have in mind here, let's say, Peter Osborne's, Terry Smith's post-socialist contemporary here appears from the repressed perspective of the other side of the Cold War and then post-Cold War narrative. The book treats the post-socialist contemporary and contemporary art within it as an instrument of capitalist modernization, or rather remodernization, at the expense of the Soviet project of modernity. And this is also counter to the more redemptive accounts of contemporary art, such as, let's say, John Roberts, who sees contemporary art as a continuation of the historical avant-garde's project of negation, right? Or again, Peter Osborne's, who sees contemporary art as a kind of a critical mirror, sort of Adornian critical mirror upon transnational operations of late capitalism. So here, right, in Octavian's account, contemporary art, as I already mentioned, is completely subsumed under the logic and dictates of neoliberal remodernization, right? I think another novelty of the book is that it works through a novel category, which is an ironic category in many ways, which is neoliberal aesthetics. And here aesthetics is used to rather signify lack of aesthetics in a traditional sense, as a sort of a semi-autonomous or autonomous regime of sensorial regime, right? In Octavian's book, the ideological critique of this lack, that neoliberalism lack aesthetics, reveals that there is actually a latent aesthetics in neoliberalism, which he calls aesthetics of problem solving. And here, the art historian Ernst Gombrich acts as its key proponent. And this problem-solving aesthetics assumes that art is a technique, right, that is inherited from tradition or through tradition, and each artist basically responds to a specific technical problem inherited through this tradition. And of course, he situates this in the context of Cold War liberalism, which another colleague of mine, Vartan Azatian, calls militant humanism, in a sense. And finally, I'd like to stress that Octavian's use of the notion of aesthetics has reverberations, to my mind, with Frederick Jameson's use of aesthetics of singularity, that characterizes not only the production of contemporary art and curatorship today, but first and foremost acts as the mode of subsumption of all aspects of social life under the regime of capital. So Esanu says, and I quote here, these new tendencies, forms, and modes of artistic production existed in direct proportion to the degree of political and economic liberalization to the countries opening towards the West and its independence from Moscow. So here, aesthetics is not really about the autonomy of sensorial regime. Its disillusion into singularity effects marks also the failure, right, of revolutionary mass politics, and is profoundly anti-political. And I have here another quote that here the curatorial function, right, comes to replace the some of the collective processes of mediation governing social relations that existed in socialism. So in a sense, the post-socialist contemporary is associated with sometimes overly identified, and this could also bring about some reductivism as well, with a supplementation of contemporary art in Eastern Europe, in Eastern Central Europe, and some of the former socialist countries by Soros. Here, the procedures, right, norms and procedures brought about the Soros contemporary as an institution is identical with the foundation or constitution of contemporary art, though it also varies, right, to what degree Soros was impactful, or Soros provided the total construction of contemporaneity and contemporary art in various contexts. So here I'll end, and sorry if I spoke maybe a bit too long.
Thank you. Sven, would you like to continue? I think you are muted.
Oh, sorry. Okay, so I'd like to begin by saying that the book overrides to some degree the idea that contemporary art cannot be looked at from the periphery of canonical art history, in this case, Eastern Europe. And in this way, it makes a very important contribution to what is really a somewhat paradoxical undertaking, namely to write the historiography of what is contemporary, right? One really needs to appreciate the paradox inherent in such a proposition. Implicit in this undertaking is the idea that contemporary art is not simply what is now, what exists, or what happens. Instead, contemporary art in this book is seen, and this is one of the things that was most impressive or about this book, or what left us with the most lasting memory. I would say it's that contemporary art here is seen as a dynamic process that reflects a very large number of active components, organizers, institutions, philosophical discourses, and so forth. And part of this idea, and this may be an idea perhaps partially taken from Foucault, is that what Octavian, I think, calls the Soros contemporary, functions as a kind of an archive, if you will, with its own administrative procedures and its own rules and regulations that, in effect, determine what can become art, or what can become, in Foucault's terminology, a statement, what, in other words, can be Soros art, to cite Foucault's famous historical a priori with a twist. So contemporary art as archive, that seems to me to be a really innovative take on what is mostly said to be concerned with what is present, what is now, and so forth, when you look at what often is described as contemporary art. So that's one of the things I found most rewarding about the book. That is to say, the fact that it presents contemporary art in Eastern Europe as a process whereby power, and power, it seems to me, is an important term here, even though it doesn't get addressed perhaps explicitly, but the power of the market clearly plays an important role, so that this power operates in a myriad of concrete and material ways, and not just vertical ones, but very often horizontal ones that get described in great detail. And this vertical force was, again, one of the things that I found most remarkable in Octavian's model. And I feel like the word model is appropriate. He is really not writing a history, as I think he himself also states, history of the Soros centers. In a way, he's modeling contemporary art in the context of Eastern Europe. And that, again, I found remarkable as well. And so, in other words, this idea of power, horizontal power, administrative power, is exercised in many ways. And these ways are, to my mind, what the book is really about. This power is exercised bureaucratically and curatorially, administratively, and so forth. And the Soros centers, to a degree, operate like miniature ministries of culture. Now, in this context, I'd like to bring up rather two terms that might amuse you, maybe, two German words, both of them used to explain the takeover of one country or region by another, And of course, to some degree, takeover is what we're talking about in Octavian's model. That is to say, the takeover of the territory of Eastern Europe by the discourse and practices of Eastern Europe, of contemporary art. That is an operation that is here tackled as the import of contemporary art / capitalism into a region that didn't, according to Octavian, have such an entity before. And the two terms that I want to bring in to explain this operation are Anschluss and Abwicklung. Anschluss and Abwicklung. These are two very different terms, but they both describe some form of territorial takeover. Now, the first one, Anschluss, is the word that was used for Hitler's annexation of Austria in 1938, and it means something like reconnecting. And it's well described by the way you put a plug into an electrical outlet into which it fits seamlessly. Now, that was exactly the metaphor used by Hitler for the way in which he reconnected Austria with Germany, where, of course, in his mind, it belonged anyway. Abwicklung is the term used by the West German agency that was charged with disposing of the remnants of the former GDR after 1989. And Abwicklung is a much more complicated term that describes a thread coming off a spool as part of a regulated process. Wickeln means to thread. By the way, it's interestingly also used when you take care of a baby. Now, why I'm mentioning these terms? Because Octavian's book describes, in a sense, like I said, the takeover of contemporary art, or the takeover of Eastern European art by the discourse and practice of contemporary art as a process that is as such much closer to Abwicklung than to Anschluss. Anschluss would have been unthinkable with a territory such as Eastern Europe, where instead of contemporary art, you had, on the one hand, social realism with continued allegiance to painting and sculpture, and on the other hand, a politically diffuse, perhaps anti-political, unofficial art that was more or less fully unequipped for the challenges of global marketization. Now, what this means is that just like GDR-style Abwicklung, this process of taking over the GDR, Soros art is both about the introduction into the space of the former Eastern Europe of something new, and crucially about the unspooling, as it were, of something that already existed. That is to say, the long tradition of East European post-war art production that, while it might outwardly resemble contemporary art, and there was plenty of that, think of Polish conceptualism, Czech action art, Yugoslav feminism, and so forth, but that art didn't conform to the Western model in at least one crucial respect. It wasn't marketable, or rather, it wasn't produced under the conditions of the a priori that I mentioned before. That is to say, that only that can pass for contemporary art, which conforms to the precepts formulated by the Ministry of Culture, by the Soros Ministry of Culture. So this leads me to another thing that Octavian's book taught me, which is that it may be worthwhile to think about the introduction of contemporary art into Eastern Europe in relation to what already existed in that space before these centers came along. And that is perhaps the single most interesting thing I found in his book. And here, as on many other occasions, I think Octavian takes a page from the book of Boris Groys, who, for better or for worse, was a crucial influence on all of those scholars, including myself, who came to Eastern European contemporary art by way of the Soviet Union, rather than by way of, say, Hungary or the Czech Republic. And I think that's an important thing to remember about this book. So what I have in mind is this: with Groys, Octavian believes that the non-political attitudes that arguably prevailed among Eastern European artists pre-1989, including, say, the Moscow conceptualists, are congruent with the anti-politics enforced by the Soros centers, which, as Octavian shows, have their roots in Popper's fear of fascism and Hayek's vaunting of the market as a superior intelligence. Now, that's something worthwhile discussing for sure. And you might argue that as a result of this, if indeed we agree with him, post-1989 Soros art in Octavian's book is fully congruent with the meditated withdrawal of something like collective actions into the forest. And Soros, as a result, emerges in a sense as the supreme conceptual artist whose art, responding to rules and regulations that he himself designed, produces precisely the artwork envisioned by the already existing networks of the Moscow conceptualists. Now, so this idea of Soros as a kind of anti-artist is something that I found a really inspiring sort of thread running through the book, even though, of course, it became never particularly explicit as such. I'm almost at the end, but I wanted to mention something else. There was another term that I felt was lurking in the background of the book, but didn't become explicit. And that is the fact that to a degree, the Shoah centers were a very didactic enterprise. They acted like a school. And this idea of the didacticism of this enterprise was something that interested me, particularly maybe because of my own preoccupations, but also because didacticism was in effect a very crucial ingredient of something like Moscow conceptualism as well. That is to say, the fact that it functions as a school. So this might be another way of connecting the pre-1989 networks with the post-1989 ones. Finally, the most, if you will, hegemonic issue that emerges from the book is, of course, the question of contemporary art and how to approach it. And Angela already mentioned this. It's clear that the take on Octavian's book on this notion is a gloomy one. That is to say, it more or less fully agrees with the idea that conceptual art is more or less homonymous with post-histoire, or with what Angela has described as the complete and total takeover of contemporary art by neoliberal capitalism. And I wanted to see whether maybe in the subsequent discussion it might be possible to complicate that notion a little bit. There are, of course, as Angela also hinted, theorists who disagree with this understanding of contemporary art, and Octavian does not. But I'm wondering if there would be perhaps a way of discussing this further to see whether openings might be found within this gloomy outlook that the book generally describes. But I don't want to stretch your patience anymore. That's more or less basically what I was thinking as I was reading the book, and all of that I found very instructive and thought-provoking. So thank you.
Thank you, Sven, for your intervention. Karolina, please.
Yeah. Firstly, I would like to thank Octavian for this fascinating, absolutely fascinating book. I find it tremendous and much needed contribution to the methodological approach to the studies on the 90s art. And actually, I have two most significant points which I found in the book. And firstly, the fact that the book adopts a critical commentary from the political left, and Octavian clearly addresses his standpoint. And I believe it will be really difficult to publish such a book, comprehensive and methodologically engaged studies from the political left perspective these days in Poland. And secondly, an advanced methodology allows us to rethink the ideology behind the so-called Soros family shows or Eastern European family shows in the 90s and the post-socialist condition of the art field. Approach presented by Octavian seems to be particularly adequate for researching countries that succeeded in rapid transformation to neoliberal ideology and market economy, and entirely replace the old political elites with new ones. It is not a coincidence that Octavian refers mostly to the Soros centers in those countries, and I mean here Estonia, Hungary, and Poland, even though Soros Center in Warsaw has existed for less than 2 years. In the Estonian case, the SCCA enjoyed hegemonic positions in 1992 and 94. However, the establishment of the Estonian Cultural Foundation and the new cultural policy, both announced in 94, ultimately set the direction for the Estonian art scene in the following years. And significantly, those two acts fit better Octavian's theory than the Soros centers. And thank you, Octavian, your book, especially the methodological part regarding anti-politics and social tone in contemporary art of the late 80s and 90s, is a unique and valuable voice in a discussion about decent art or political art that recently has been hijacked by the political right discourse, especially in countries like Poland. Octavian's book reflects not only on global shift to new cultural policy and the global process of the politicization of art that undeniably likewise had its impact on Central and Eastern European artistic practice. In this context, Octavian carefully dissected anti-politics as a part of Eastern European artistic paradigm and the long tradition of aesthetic solutions, which I find extremely inspiring. In that context of the Estonian Art Week, for example, where NGOs replaced governmental institutions, including the National Museum, Octavian casts a brand new light on neoliberal corporate management as a significant aspect of contemporary art and its institutions. So thank you for this inspiring volume.
Thank you, Karolina. I also add my own points, and then we can move towards the next question. So I would like to start by emphasizing that it is not accidental that we choose this volume or we choose to organize this roundtable around this volume to kick off the international aspects or international presence of our research project on the Hungarian art of the 1980s. And I think there are several reasons why this book or this event could serve as a great starting point. On the one hand, because Octavian's book entangles the 1980s and the 1990s, as he follows the historical trajectory of the Soros Centers for Contemporary Art, that the first was kicked off in '85 in Budapest, and the actual network emerged in the 90s. And through this track, he follows the fact that how continuities work between the 1980s and 1990s. And I think it's a really important aspect because the rupture nature of the post-socialist transition of 1989 is really widely emphasized. And I think it's much less typical to emphasize also the continuities. And of course, ruptures and continuities are not exclusive. There were also ruptures, and both ruptures and continuities. But I think for me, one of the central values of the book that it somehow entangles the late socialist and the post-socialist period and showing the continuities between these decades. And other central value of the book for me is the fact that on the one hand, it's a multi-level ethnography or a multi-level volume. On the one hand, it examines local art scenes and national states, but also examines global processes, global trends, and as Sven emphasized, global power relations. And I think this multi-level nature of the analysis is really important because art scenes are never connected only one level, but they are always working in several levels at the same time. And at the same time, Octavian's volume is not purely a multi-level scholarship, but also multi-sited. So he is not only researching the art scenes of Budapest and Tallinn and Kiev and Chisinau, but also he has empirical material from Moscow and from Boston. And I think this multi-sited nature is really a strength of the volume. And this especially important because I think we should always somehow entangle and interweave local and global art histories and to show that they are actually inseparable. And this is especially important because methodological nationalism when nation states are considered as closed containers is pretty typical, not only in art historiography. And I think in this sense, this volume also goes against this methodological nationalist approach of art and culture. And I think this is an especially important thing because through this case, this volume also offers a model to discuss hierarchical power relations and to discuss uneven global structures without falling into the pitfall of ethno-nationalist politics that is so widespread. So therefore, maybe a key takeaway of the book for me is the fact that it offers a path to avoid both the silent acknowledgement of global power structures and at the same time to avoid the narcissism of the subjugated ones. And I think this is a key strength of the book that could be, of course, further discussed through our webinar. And after my monologue, I would like to ask a question directly to Octavian. And of course, you are also free to reflect on the already mentioned things. But my question is that is tackling the fact that you are offering a highly critical perspective of the Soros Centers for Contemporary Art. But at the same time, you also work there. And I would like to ask a kind of autoethnographic question to ask that how, on the one hand, how your position shaped by the book project and how your research perspective and research project emerged from your personal experience. So I would like to ask that how did your criticism emerge and how do you look back to your own activities of the 90s?
Hello, everyone. I'm thankful, first of all, to all of you who participate in this event, David, Kristóf, Karolina, Angela, Sven, and everyone else who showed interest in my work. I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful for your feedback. I discovered some interesting points that I didn't somehow even think about them. That's also an interesting thing. Well, to answer the question about ethno aspect of his work, this is a very personal book which attempted to engage with some questions or with some problems, let's call them, that I ran into in 1990s, when all of a sudden we've learned about Soros and his emergence in all of these post-Soviet republics, countries. So at that point, I had a long range of impressions. I would call them impressions, like questions that I would ask myself. I would ask myself, for example, well, you know, when the Soviet army came in 1945, they brought an aesthetic doctrine, was called socialist realism, right? And everything was written, everything was explained, everything was clear. What is it about? What artists must do? What artists must struggle for? How artists must make art, and so on. Now we are faced with a new paradigm of reorganizing the arts that lacks any, how should I say it? It lacks an political and aesthetic, maybe, a discussion about what exactly contemporary art is. It had a lot of instruction, which were managerial instructions, how to fund artists, how to advertise a grant, how to choose an artist in a show, how to fund this artist and that artist, how to do this, that, and that. And this has been a very productive, and a lot of writing has been involved in that. But it still lacked this idea of like more aesthetic ideas that I was expecting, which I guess in my post-socialist naivete, I was hoping that, you know, Soros would come and would tell us exactly what kind of art we were expected to produce, which of course is not the case. So yes, this is one thing that then served as an initial impulse in my later research when I started to kind of look into readings and trying to understand what is it thing called a contemporary art, where it comes from, who were the ones to use it first and why, and what's wrong with other periodizations like modern art, what happened to postmodernism, because around the time when Soros came, people talked about postmodernism. It was rare when people spoke about contemporary art. Was a phrase mainly used for institutions. Right? So like Soros Centers of Art used to call its program And when they would assemble a congress or an art exhibition, everyone would talk about postmodernism. So I was asking myself why there is this discrepancy between these labels of art historical periodization. Is it postmodernism? Are we in now, or is this contemporary art? So all of these kind of questions were in the early phase. We've been also traveling a lot. We had a lot of seminars, Soros organized conferences and training places. Like people used to be flown into Budapest, Warsaw, in all of these countries with a more solid experience of art that is not socialist. And in the book, I actually talk about that what people sometimes perceive as this Soviet bloc, as this one thing where everything looks the same. It was not the case, and it is still not the case. Like, you cannot compare a Polish art in Hungary, Slovenia, with countries in the former republics of the USSR, art in Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Moldova. There is a total different temporality of how all of these forms of art emerge and so on. So this is about my kind of ethno engagement. Also to say, it's true. Yes, I've been working for Soros. I mean, it's a long story how I ended up in there, but I did work for that, and I think it is hardly you'll find anyone in the 90s who wasn't benefiting in some way or another from Soros, right? Like, I mean, even now the president of Hungary, right? He's also the product of Soros, right? So everyone who had anything to do, anything to accomplish in any field, be this Marxism or revival of Western Marxian approaches, they all got the support from the Soros funds. And in this regard, I think if you go by the fact that you cannot criticize or you cannot deal critically with this, I think it would be a contradiction. And it's not only because Popper, who was the intellectual mentor of Soros, has put forward this idea of fallibility, this idea that truth and propositions are always open to interpretation. They always need to be questioned. This is all in the spirit of enlightenment, right? This is all in the spirit of progress. Like I remember the first time when I wrote about Soros, it was in the 2000 and something like 7 or 8. I was asked why I write critically about Soros Foundation. Do I want to go back to socialism? And I said, gosh, no, I don't want to go back. But at the same time, we cannot not criticize. We cannot stop being critics. We cannot give up this idea of these ideas, I would call them, of enlightenment, this idea of progress, on which, it's our activity must be regarded as a source of continuous, criticism, as a source of, and there is frankly also a lot in the doctrine of the open society. There is a lot to be criticized. I mean, the doctrine, it's ideology, this idea that everyone is open to freedom of speech and so on, that is all cool and nice. But when it comes to economic inequalities, for example, open society cannot solve that. So all of these doctrines that comes with Popper and Soros, Hayek, Friedman, all of this, what we nowadays call neoliberalism, all of this insistence that you need to engage in the market and you need to run in this market schema every day until you prove to everyone else that you are the strongest, smartest, whatever. That's not, I think, what the ideas of that enlightenment were, maybe, because we can see around us, there is a lot of disadvantaged people and a lot of disadvantaged artists. Like I remember in my home country, they were this called a union of artists. These were like many artists who used to receive funding from the state, subsidies and so on. Of course, their art was boring, uninteresting, you know, whatever. But at the same time, this schema overnight, they've been left overboard. They've been left with no support at all. No? And that's not only in my place. I've seen it everywhere. I've seen it in many other countries. So all of my reflections that come in this book are kind of trying to understand all of these contradictions, all of these problems, all of these things that I was observing around me, and I looked around me and trying to understand. And also, I would say it's a book that wanted to say something coming from the East, right? Because we all know that the most influential theories of art were still published in London, New York, right? Like everything that has something to tell us how to read art, where it comes from, we still have to look to other places. So I wanted to produce something that would come exactly from a place that doesn't have, you know, that cultural capital, that doesn't have that symbolic power, but still had a long tradition of art. Still has a long, it has a rich history to share with the world. And finally, maybe I will close my autobiographic or autoethnographic remarks by saying that this is a book that was written in that period after 89 to 2022. And I'm referring here to the war in Ukraine, because I strongly believe now that the era of post-socialism is over, right? Like, now we can say that 1989 to 2022, we can close, at least for those in Eastern Europe. I think that invasion, that war that is going on now has changed. I don't know, I wouldn't risk to say it now. Will it mean that it will come a new epoch, a new kind of art that will be called, I don't know what, but for certain that has put a very conclusive point to what we've called after 89 post-socialism, transition, all of that kind of stuff. And if we maybe expected it to go in the direction of more democracy and more freedoms, I think it worked kind of the opposite, at least again, what I'm seeing it's going on in Ukraine. So if this book would have been written now, I am confident it would have a different tone. It would have a different way of engaging with the problematics of art after 89. It would be a different product. You know? But it came before 2022, and it is what it is. It's the product of that age that I think we've left behind. Thank you. That's all for now.
Thank you, Octavian, for your remarks and for your self-reflections. I have a second round question for our invited speakers, and thanks for Octavian for mentioning the present moment, because my question also leads towards the present. And I have the impression, your volume offers a critical historiography of contemporary art, and as you mentioned, it is written from a post-socialist perspective. It is written from a kind of periphery of the art world. And my question tackles the problematic that in Eastern Europe, or I think in general in the peripheries of the art world, the paradigm of the contemporary art has never achieved a complete dominance, has never achieved a complete takeover. So how can we assess this partial success, if I may label it? So how can we assess this partial success or partial dominance of contemporary art in the peripheries or semi-peripheries of the art world? And I think it is especially a relevant question because to ask that how can we evaluate the present trajectories of contemporary art in a world in which its underpinning regime that you define as neoliberal capitalism is in crisis. So I can just mention that how global value chains during fall apart during COVID. So we can really detect these moments of crisis everywhere in our life nowadays. And how can we reread the trajectory of contemporary art from this present moment, especially if we follow these volumes historical materials account of artistic change, which doesn't approach artistic change in itself, but it really deeply embeds it into material changes. So yeah, it's a pretty extensive question, and I think you can answer it from several different angles by focusing on several different aspects. But I think I would like to open a second round for our speakers to talk about this maybe partial takeover of contemporary art in Eastern Europe and the interrelation of neoliberal capitalism and contemporary art in the present world.
Yeah, I mean, it's a complicated question. Kristóf, you talked before a lot about sort of a new paradigm of talking about contemporary art as a matter of dynamic interaction between different hemispheres, connectivities, and so forth. And that's obviously sort of the new trend. And Octavian's book makes an interesting contribution to this, yet one that is somewhat ambiguous, because on the one hand, one gets the impression that contemporary art is imported through Soros, through the Soros centers, into a space where such art didn't exist before. Yet on the other hand, of course, and I'm simplifying the argument, yet on the other hand, of course, there were such things as Polish conceptual art, Czech action art, there was a lot of performance art. There were lots of art practices that developed behind the Iron Curtain that we might qualify as contemporary art, even where, of course, they had not been produced under the precepts of the neoliberal market, right? Because they were exempt from that market. But they had, of course, been created a lot of the time in close connection with art practices that were occurring in the West, because while it is true that the Soviet Union was more or less fully and hermetically sealed in terms of personal contacts from the outside world, that was not the case with Central Europe, where artists, depending on which country you found yourself in, often had quite extensive contact with, let's say, artists in the West, and where their art practice often developed in close conjunction with those artists and their practices. So the experiment, in a way, is that Octavian is sort of setting up, consists in managing this ambivalence between connectivity and its opposite. That is to say, the assumption that with the arrival of Soros in Eastern Europe, something was introduced into that space that really didn't exist there before. So I wondered if maybe that's a discussion sort of that we could have. And the ironic thing is that, in a sense, what I hear Octavian argue, and I may be wrong about this, is that actually contemporary art ended right there in Eastern Europe, because in a sense, the merging of the managerial with the artistic that he in effect describes makes the two more or less mutually exchangeable, right? So the manager produces as much a work of art, the one who writes and conforms to the manager who writes the rules, is, as it were, as much an artist as the artist who conforms to those rules by picking them up and turning him or herself into a contemporary artist. So, so I would be interested in discussing these sort of ambiguities a little bit more, and they all go back to my initial point about the way in which the book, in a way that Angela has rightly identified as totalizing, identifies contemporary art with neoliberal economics and omnipresent totalizing marketization.
Perhaps I'll follow Sven's comment. So I think that the assumption that there are places where contemporary art has completely taken over or has triumphed is itself kind of a fantasy. I think the recent Documenta is a good example, right, where the contemporary art exhibition with its progressive politics, a curatorial team that is cosmopolitan and so on, clashes with the local cultural politics that is not so contemporary, right, in the very center where the contemporary art has emerged in the post-war context in Europe, right, in Kassel. But also, like, we have to place Eastern Europe somewhat differently from other peripheries of contemporary art, because I think I mentioned before, I believe that Eastern Europe is sort of, and the former Soviet Union is the primal scene of contemporary arts globalization. Why? Because it is due to the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Berlin Wall, that the unprecedented globalization of contemporary art itself becomes possible, right? The Soviet Union being, whether formally or truly, the only geopolitical sphere where market relations supposedly didn't function, right? Or were outside of market relations. As a primal scene of contemporary arts globalization, also we need to be careful in in placing a total rupture, placing 1989 as a total rupture, because I think there were processes from within the Soviet Union, at least like I trace it, or I believe that it can be traced to de-Stalinization, Khrushchev's program of de-Stalinization that opened the door for a kind of a second counterculture, a counterculture that was kind of an official opposition, right, to the official cultural politics of socialist realism. And it is that counterculture that evolves into a dissident subculture that later on prepares the ground for the institutionalization of contemporary art in the late 80s and 90s in many of the contexts of Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. So coming back to this question of like, what can we see from the peripheries, right? I do believe that, yes, there are different degrees of subsumption, of temporality under the contemporary in different contexts of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. And the contemporary that functions as this kind of umbrella term that denotes a certain kind of abstract universality, right? That comes to subsume supposedly different temporalities, contexts, national traditions, schools, socialist outmoded remains of socialist realism, also has various impacts on different contexts of the former Soviet Union and the post-socialist East. So in a sense, contemporary art, when it clashes with various temporalities that are complexly mediated, makes visible perhaps several contradictions at play, contradictions that are embedded in the structural operations of global contemporary as it expands, as its logic, through its logic of expansion, right? It expands towards hitherto undiscovered spheres and spaces. For instance, Octavian's book mentions Afghanistan, where contemporary art is being introduced in the aftermath of the invasion of the American troops. So in a sense, these operations of the global contemporary can be acutely recognized in the peripheries because the encounter between the modus operandi of global contemporary art and its abstract universality and ahistoricity in the peripheries of late capitalism reveals that there exist heterogeneous temporalities within capitalism itself. So these are not outside of capitalism, but are within it. And the encounter with the periphery perhaps shows the processes of capitalist modernization through contemporary art under a sort of magnifying glass, or like as a slow motion film, right? So perhaps what are these processes, right, that the periphery reveals, especially in the case of Eastern Europe, but as a special periphery, as I mentioned, as the primal scene of contemporary arts globalization. First of all, for the production of contemporary art relies exclusively on private or NGO money. it replaces the formerly state secure and publicly remunerated labor of the artist with temporary, situational, and precarious opportunities for the artist. Here, and Octavian delves into this, the curator, right, becomes a functionary, a key functionary in these processes of mediation, both symbolic and monetary. In its form of production, contemporary art utilizes transdisciplinary tools and media, opened up by the expanded field of postmodernism, often vis-a-vis the fine arts that still rely on painting and sculpture or medium-specific forms. But at the same time, it often seeks pre-modern subjects to reveal an imagined outside to this hyper-technologized world. And my example is, a video program that I remember years ago, even like more than a decade ago, organized in Manchester, of Central Asian video art that was called tele-shamanism, right? There's always kind of an expectation that there is a kind of an exotic outside that is revealed through a subject matter. And finally, I think that contemporary art from the post-Soviet periphery shows that contemporary art is born out of a certain anti-Soviet consciousness and attitudes that has been carried forth by the dissident intelligentsia and artists in the 80s through the 90s, through the post-socialist transition. And one key point that I think Octavian's book also makes clear is that contemporary art comes to operate or is constituted on the debris of Soviet modernization project, as this project collapses, as its historical experience is being erased. So that's, but the question, how do we write art history today following a materialist historical approach? I think we do as we follow the book in a sense, always historicize and always tackle the structural foundations, right? That inform, constitute artistic forms, artistic discourses, something that the book does very well. And it remains to be seen whether we are still in the epoch of global neoliberalism or neoliberalist globalization, or is it neoliberalism with an anti-globalization impulses that we have both in Eastern Europe, but also in Western Europe as the right triumphs politically. Thanks.
Karolina, would you like to continue?
Yes, actually, I would like to continue. And Octavian's book argues that contemporary art, the paradigm of contemporary art was transferred from the West, and it's an neoliberal anti-politics was transferred from the Western countries and just followed by Eastern countries, by Eastern European countries. But actually, to flip the question is about the transfer of knowledge in the modern world system. If the contemporary art represented by the core tends to be anti-political or apolitical, shouldn't we actually expect that peripheries just follow those tendencies? And actually, I found like a bit, Octavian is a bit like surprised that this pattern was just applied in the 90s, but maybe a different approach might be needed, especially when discussing the present moment. And I suggest the alter-globalist or horizontal art history and its methodology may offer an interesting solution for analyzing some of Eastern European or Asian countries' conditions, because we must remember that Soros centers, those protagonists of Octavian's book, offered an interesting geopolitics that included countries like Kazakhstan into the spectrum of Eastern Europe and its artistic traditions. And it inspires a question. Where is the post-Cold center core located? Those peripheries aspire to. And let me use the Estonian example. Actually, I'm a Polish Estonian researcher. That's why I refer so often to both Polish and Estonian examples. So in the 90s in Estonia, it was Finnish contemporary art and its institutions that predominantly served as the model for Estonian transformation. And at the same time, Finland was considered a semi-periphery in the artwork system. And on the other hand, the shift towards so-called new cultural politics has been observed globally since the 70s. And there are many reasons behind it. However, it doesn't manifest solely in contemporary art and its institutions. And definitely, it's not limited to post-socialist condition. And for example, the Polish art of the 90s, especially the current known as Polish critical art, has been politically and socially engaged. And today, Polish artists depoliticize their practice when all spheres of life are highly politicized and polarized. And apart from global trends, there are several reasons for that. And firstly, the political right hijacked the discourse of political and socially engaged art. And moreover, it seized control over many institutions on a national and municipal level. So therefore, there are just few institutions interested in activism. And secondly, as Octavian correctly observes, Polish art enjoys a long tradition of radical apoliticization of art as a critic of highly politicized settings. And on the other hand, Estonian artists, in comparison with Polish artists, are much more vocal about political activism, and moreover, radical institutions like Contemporary Art Museum, KEMKI in Tallinn tend to host critical and anti-political projects. So I think that those problems are very multi-dimensional, and I like that. I really enjoy that Octavian's books try to follow those different trajectories and different approaches in different regions of Central, Eastern, or not maybe that European as Kazakhstan if it comes to geopolitics.
Thank you, everybody. I wanted to address some of the things that I think a little bit been misunderstood in my work. Sven's idea that contemporary art was imported, I don't make such claims, Sven, in this book. I'm saying in countries like, for example, in Slovenia, video art emerges at the same time with United States of America, 1970s. Hungary, Poland, they all had radical forms of art long ago under socialism, in Russia as well. But they were not called contemporary art. This was called non-conformism, unofficial art, dissident art. Each country, and underground art, each country had its own terminology for that. So that's why I'm not claiming that that Soros brought contemporary art in these places, because only in some cases, and I'm speaking about a few countries like my own country, Moldova, for example, we didn't have in the 80s any form of artistic engagement that are affiliated with contemporary art, be this performance art, computer-generated video art, all of that. And it's not only that, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and many other places, we didn't have that. So I'm saying that there are two, in this block, in this Soviet bloc, there is concrete cases, and you cannot approach them as one. That's why, for me, it was extremely hard to write it, to find a position from which to write a book about 20 centers of art. These are 18 countries. Each of these countries has its own language, history, artists, art institution. This is an impossible task for someone to engage and to try to understand what's going on empirically in each of them. That's why I was struggling really hard to understand how can we still speak about what is it that unites them, what is it that they have in common. So contemporary art in all of these places like Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovenia, Yugoslavia, Estonia, Latvia to some extent, it already exists. Like I have a reviewer who wrote about that I don't discuss the art in the book, and I don't because I think that Soros Center didn't introduce nothing new in art. All the art that is of the 90s is the art that already has emerged in the 70s and 80s. The only art that Soros introduces is internet art. It's the time when this art emerges globally. It's the rise of browsers, Netscape browser, all of this, and Soros funds these programs of establishing internet hubs in Eastern Europe, and these hubs emerge commercially also in the United States and UK. So that's the only art that emerges globally as a new form of artistic expression in the 90s. Other forms, they existed. I don't make any claims that he imported art in there. I think what he imported is the managerial, and what I call contemporary art is precisely the curatorial function, right? Like Eastern Europe didn't have curators. Again, with exception in Hungary, in Poland, they existed some, but there was not a global phenomenon. And I go through archives and I look people in Estonia, in Kazakhstan, in Latvia, in this country says that the function of curation was brought to us by the Soros Center of Art. So this is not saying it brought art, no, it brought the mechanism by which these most radical forms of artistic expression, most interesting, newest forms are being now mediated, are being now presented. It introduces archives, right? It introduces documentation. It introduces funding for the artists. That is not anymore everyone gets funding like in socialist realism because you're an artist. No, you apply now, and there is an entire procedure of how you apply, what you submit. You write your CV, you write your project. So it's like this logic of neoliberal logic of applying for capital. You need to convince the funder that your capital, that the capital that you get will be properly developed, and it will expand, and so and all of this kind of art, right? So this is what I speak about when I talk. And Angela is right in saying that de-Stalinization. Yes, it is the de-Stalinization, and I have a chapter there, not a chapter, but a section of the chapter where I basically show how in Russia, in the process of de-Stalinization, starts all of these waves of so-called non-conformist art, right? So it starts them, but again, Poland is already much ahead. Like in Poland, de-Stalinization happens even earlier than So what I'm saying is we cannot homogenize, we cannot call, like when sometimes people write from the West, they say the Western bloc, treating this as a homogeneous one phenomena where everything looks exactly the same. No, it did not look exactly the same. And my project was to try and find a way of how to still engage with it, given its heterogeneity, given its complex complex particularity and everything in these places. And again, the network, this idea that Soros established 2018 centers, these ideas of networks were already present in Eastern Europe in the 70s, like Art Pool in Hungary, and people affiliated with this, they were the first already to say, let's form networks of artists who would go across borders, and they initiated so many projects with postal art, mail art, exchange and traveling across borders. So all of this is nothing new. I don't think that Soros invented the networks in Eastern Europe. They already were there present in the underground. And what happened, they were only, as the book called them, institutionalize them, turn them into concrete institutional structures that now can offer you services, archives, curators arrive. They don't need to go to students, to artists' apartments. They can go to one centralized place, open the archives, and choose the artist for that exhibition. So that is what, for me, contemporary art is. It's this kind of way of organizing artistic production. That's and Kristóf, finally, you, in your question about contemporary art didn't win, and there's still some islands of non-contemporary art. I think this is not unusual. Even in United States, you can find the unions of artists, like unions of artists, some remains of the old paradigms. They always exist in art, like if you study art history, if you look at the Regal or people who studied art of late Roman age, they will say everyone used to focus on the fine arts, everyone ignored tapestry or ignored arts that were regarded as not as high. So there have always been arts that have been treated more like speaking to the zeitgeist, speaking to the times, and arts that were left aside because they were considered irrelevant for the time. And who knows, maybe at some point, I doubt socialist realism regain its powers unless I don't know what happens. But I think it didn't win only here. You can find countries in the West, highly developed countries, who have contemporary art that is shown in the biggest museums, venues, and you still have a lot of artists, what are those called? Artisanal guilds, associations, societies, where they still come together to produce good old fine arts, sculptures, ceramics, but I think it's everywhere. It's not. Thank you.
Can I just make a brief footnote on what Octavian just said?
Go ahead.
Octavian, thanks. That was really illuminating. I just wanted to briefly comment on this point regarding the import of contemporary art, since you said that the book is not claiming that there was no contemporary art. I get before the Soros centers were opened, I completely get that point. But to the extent that you're not claiming that contemporary art is simply any art that is produced in the present, but that contemporary art is defined as this merging of the managerial, with art production. To that extent, contemporary art did not exist in Eastern Europe before the changes of 1989 that you use as your departure point. And as you point out, it's absolutely true that not only networks, but didactic art, didacticism, which again, I feel is very important in the book, the managerial, the network were things that pre-existed these changes. What makes the difference in essence is the presence of capital, right? It is the capitalization of these functions in ways, and the marketization in ways that were previously unknown in Eastern Europe. But otherwise, much of that existed, of course, functioning in very different ways. The network for the Moscow conceptualists functioned in ways utterly different from the ways in which you describe them in your book. So I just wanted to clarify that nobody is claiming that, that you say that there was no contemporary art, there was no art production, as it were, that in so many ways, was congruous with the art production in Western Europe, in Eastern Europe. So just wanted to make sure that that was understood properly.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. I think we need to just agree on the term how do we use this phrase contemporary art, because it's extremely hard, extremely confusing, and you need to spend a lot of energy to try to explain what do you mean by these words, basically, you know, because otherwise it's getting too complicated. Yes, I agree.
Thank you. I have one more really nice question, but I think time is running, so it's really time to open up the floor for the audience and to keep my question maybe for the later part of the discussion, maybe for our next discussion. And so if you have any question, please raise your hands via Zoom. And Aaron already wrote in the chat that he has a question, so go ahead or comment.
Hi everyone. Thanks so much for making this talk happen, Kristóf. It's super interesting to hear everyone's point of view. I just wanted to follow from, well, I had a point that I wanted to make, but just as a way to follow, I have a point and a question, but just to follow from what you guys were just saying, I think it's important to not call this contemporary art. But I think I in a way see what the SCCA network was doing is almost very similar to what the Open Society's internet program was doing. So I look at it, contemporary art as a communication technology that they're implementing and using to perform these acts of hygiene through bureaucracy and so forth in society. One thing about your book, Octavian, that I had trouble with as a kind of a curatorial historian myself is that you contextualize the emergence of curatorial practice, which in the network as occurring in relationship to Paul O'Neill's research, as occurring within this super visible phase of the industry. And of course, it's a moment when all of the curating schools are actually appearing. So this is the professionalization of the curatorial practice is really happening in this moment in the early 90s. And it's, I believe, still in a rather experimental place. But Paul O'Neill's research doesn't take into account the history of the SCCA network. In fact, he doesn't acknowledge it, and as far as I can tell, anywhere in his writings. And so and I believe that his history of curating would dramatically change if he knew about it, or if he factored it in terms of what we consider an evolution of a language. Because what happens with the curatorial function in the SCCA network is by leaps and bounds more advanced than other things happening in the industry in the West. And so that leads to my question, this idea that there was not a directive on how to make art because it didn't appear in the procedures manual, or because there was no clear notion of what to look for in this idea of the art of the open society. I think that's missing something. I think that this curatorial function is exactly the way in which art was told how to be made. When we look at the open calls for the shows like Polyphony or 010101, some of the early shows before the network is fully matured, and people are operating autonomously. There's this, what Karolina refers to as the synchronization of the network. And through this kind of coercion of the open calls, you actually have, from the point of conception in the artist creative practice, an encouragement to produce art that is some of the most advanced socially engaged practice of its time. And so I just, in a way, you know, my question was, what is the point of saying I don't know, I don't agree with this idea that there was not an instruction to make certain kinds of art, or an instruction to make art that was a very specific form of contemporary art that you almost had to adhere to, otherwise you would not receive support. And this, and I think it's a problem when thinking about what your book will do, because it creates this idea that there was a naturally occurring phenomenon of contemporary art that the SCCA was just facilitating and stewarding. And in fact, it's a much more direct action approach to art making, and in fact, implementing a very specific kind of art making that is this art of the open society, or art of, honestly, I think it's the most advanced form of socially engaged practice that we know of.
Yeah, I think I first of all, I talk about Paul O'Neill's book in order to show that this rise of the curatorial function, it's almost occurring contemporaneously in Eastern Europe and in the West, right? So, of course, in the West, it has a longer history, but in Eastern Europe, it comes into the latest phase when this curatorial function is totally institutionalized and is already established with schools of curators, programs of training curators. So this comes at a time when already Soros funds this, like in the CCA network, he did fund a lot of seminars where you basically train how to be a curator. About your other question that curators don't make the artists, that curators don't have any impact on the artist art, I don't think I make that claim. I recall I even cite a Romanian case with Erwin Kessler when he wrote a review about one of the first CCA Bucharest shows, where he talks about how artists who never ever practiced any video, computer, or any of that kind of art were invited, and they were told, we are giving you cameras, computers, scanners, whatever you want. And they spent a lot on that. We giving you that, please engage with these forms, right? So they did engage and they produced a very impressive show. But then Kessler asked, and what are you gonna do after this? And the artist said, well, we're gonna go back and do what we usually do. We paint, we sculpt, we do all of that stuff, you know? So in a way, I'm not making the claim that curators don't shape, don't kind of give the form of artistic, especially, I mean, in some countries though, let's say in more advanced countries, in terms of artistic discourse, I think that was less noticeable. Maybe I would say that the curators had less of a power over the artists than in those countries where the new form of artistic practices called contemporary or postmodernism had not such a long tradition. Here, the curator had a very strong power to say and even to influence what the artists do. And even in the case of a Polyphonia exhibition in Hungary, I remember from what, I mean, that's been already some time ago I wrote, but I remember the curators have also kind of made their voice of what the exhibition should look like and how it should look like and where it should appear and how it should appear. Now, is this good or is this not good? I think that's another question that we have to discuss. And here I come to the debate exchange between Zeman and the French artist whose name now escapes me, who talks about the power of curators in contemporary art, right? So I don't know, did I answer your?
Well, I wasn't saying that they didn't have this power. I was saying they have total control over the conception process, and the artist's entire creative practice has essentially from point zero, from this point of when you come up with your creative thoughts, you are already controlled by what the open call is telling you to make. And in Polyphony in particular, it has very specific instructions of progressive humanitarian issues, and also in 010101, you're telling artists to go out into fringe environments like mentally insane asylums and so forth. Polyphony in particular is encouraging the engagement of all kinds of social issues that are not naturally a part of artist dialogues or artist creative practices at that time. And then Susie Masoli even reflected after the exhibition that things were not political enough in that regard. So I think it also kind of undermines this notion of the anti-political when we think of how politically activated the artist practice was supposed to be towards progressive issues, meaning obviously they weren't like ultra left or ultra right issues, but they were these neoliberal progressive issues that were basically in the service of the NGO. You know, you're making the artist make art that is in the service of what the NGO wants to have happen in terms of its hygiene of society.
Okay.
I think that's what.
Can I just make a small remark to this? Because it wasn't really, the problem wasn't really solely to the source centers of contemporary art, because very similar approach how contemporary art should look like, for example, was announced by Estonian government as an official policy in 1994, and those directives were much more radical if it comes to what ideal contemporary Estonian art should look like, and how modern and what sort of modern mediums and problems they should tackle. So it's not. I mean, this is also that's why I like Octavian's book, because his approach doesn't really refers only to the problem of Soros sentences, but for the general problem of modernization of art and artistic institutions in many countries, like for example Poland and Estonia.
Sven, you also started?
No, I just wanted to say that I felt that Octavian was in agreement with much of what I heard Aaron say, but I may be wrong.
No, I was in agreement. I am in agreement, yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just from the point of moderation, I would like to emphasize that it is not accidental that the discussion is revolving around curatorial function and curatorship, because in the volume there is an entire chapter on the rise of curators in the SCCA network. So if you are more interested in this in more depth, just read the chapter. We have still something like 5 minutes, so there is time for questions. Maybe we can also collect 2 questions if there are questions in the audience. Yes, Gabor, go ahead.
Hi everyone, thank you for the presentation, thank you for the volume, thank you for the discussion, and to KEMKI to organize this event. My question would, I mean, maybe it's a really stupid thing to ask, but it keeps coming back to me, this revolving around the concept of contemporary art, or like the notion of this concept. And my question would be something like, I feel that if we agree, as I feel we are in agreement, that under socialism or the communist regimes, there were, and in fact in many places, plentiful unofficial or dissident practices, producers of art, individuals or collectives. And at the same time, we also accept this proposal that I heard coming out from today's discussion, that contemporary art is kind of always already totally subsumed under neoliberal market rules. That doesn't it close a door on a variety of artistic production we could call either social practice, or, to use a more regional specific word, post-artistic practices as contemporary art production? Like, yeah. What I mean is, like, I feel that the definition might not be as easy as the total subsumption under markets. It's a little like, what I mean is that when we talk about the idea of the commons, we kind of have to accept that, yeah, it might not be possible for it to be defined existing outside of the regime of neoliberal market rules, but at the same time, it is possible to carve out spaces. And in my understanding, contemporary art could offer, or could be, a little wider of an umbrella, where we could even consider post-artistic or social practice to be part of it. And maybe one suggestion to, or like the way I was reading this great book or the way I was understanding it, as if like I would insert the notion of the semi-periphery into the conversation, because I think it really matches what you guys have been talking about, whether there were spaces in the former Eastern Europe where certain contemporary artistic productions were possible, but then there were other places, let's say the former member states of the USSR, where it wasn't that much. I think it would be a good frame for that as well. And yeah, thank you again.
Is it I to answer, or anyone else would like to answer? It's me. Yeah. Well, look, I mean, first of all, I want to say that, as already with Sven, we need to find a way to be able to talk about contemporary art, because it's a very difficult term, and my main interest was to look at it as a historical label, as a periodization label. So that's why, of course, it's extremely difficult, and it's hard to claim something and not to claim in the same time, because there are indeed many artists who are doing great work and great job, and we cannot say that all of them are serving lackeys of capitalism, that all of them are, no, of course it's not. I'm not saying that, and I hope I will not be understood as saying that. Like, I would say, like, in the case of many countries, like Soros program of contemporary art, its funding has allowed us to modernize our artistic discourse, which otherwise would have been impossible, right? So if we all agree, if we all embrace this image of us going towards a better future, call it progress, enlightenment, then, of course, we need to kind of to be at some point also say that not all that artists do nowadays is completely subsumed on the capitalist, So in a way, I need to kind of maybe express that it's a little bit also difficult and hard to be able to talk about it without driving these big generalizations and making these large conclusions that all of contemporary art is. But the way I thought about it, all that I invest or all that I associate with kind of the bad things that needs to be improved, I kind of link them to the phrase contemporary art, because I don't know why, but this is the phrase that most of the time is used in managerial, museum. I mean, it became such a parasite, word phrase is being monetized, it's being used for profit, it's being used for this, for that, So I don't know. I also don't agree. Like, I know there are critics who say nowadays, who write that let's get out of contemporary art. I think this is utopian. You cannot just say, okay, let's all of us stop using contemporary art and invent another phrase, words, and start using that, because in the end, it's a symptom of a bigger problem I think we face. And so I don't have an answer to that. I don't know what or how to make it possible to find a way to talk about artists that are still not completely like subsumed under the. But I mean, to be frank, in a way, I think the role of the artist in our times is completely different than what it was maybe in other ages. I don't know, I may be wrong about that, but I'm looking around, I work in the art field, I'm looking how artists live and what they do and how they do. And I think in some way, there is a way of co-option. There is a way where art is expected to be this affirmative kind of lifestyle and stuff. But at the same time, yes, there are many artists and critics and historians who try to salvage it, who try to rescue, to try to find a way for us of which we can still have words to apply to that art that is really important. And because there is a lot of art that needs to be done and has to be done and is done. And how we do that, this is, I think, our task as critics to invent these words. I don't know. That would be my answer. But I'm sure maybe other people.
Interesting question, though, because it touches on your understanding of politics in the book. Like, you know, what kinds of understanding of what is political do you presume? And clearly, I mean, we invoke the Soviet experiment and Marxism, you know, from the point of view of that kind of politics, I would imagine being political is almost excluded under the model that you outline. So the question puts its finger on a very interesting question, that is to say, is there room for a political project, you know, given the parameters that you've set for what passes for contemporary art under the regulation set up by the Soros centers? And I would say that's what I meant initially by gloominess. One gets the impression that it's very hard to imagine that artists would be able to formulate a political project that would escape from the totalization that marks contemporary art as written under Soros precepts.
Yeah, I just have to explain, because a lot of the times people make references to my use of the term anti-politics. And when I use the term anti-politics, I use it with regard to as being the opposite of the tradition of mass politics that used to inform artist works until, say, World War II, right? Like at the time when Picasso was the member of Communist Party, and that was a mass political movements called the National Fronts, Bolshevik, Communist, and so on. So this crisis of the mass universal way of agreeing on a political matter, like in Marxism, the agreement is universal, that there is exploiters and exploited. We need to do something about that. That crisis, I see contemporary art and anti-politics, which refers precisely to that crisis, that you cannot anymore, that this Marxism will not save us anymore, but we need to address our individual independent problems, right? That's what basically anti-politics is. I see it as a symptom of contemporary art, right? So it does not mean that there is no politics anymore. No, there is politics, there is a lot of politics. What I claim is not anymore the politics of modernism, right? Because contemporary art is, in a way I understand, is the opposite of modernism, which was based around the idea of mass universal political engagement. This we don't have anymore. Our political struggle is fragmented, our political interests are singular. So just to explain this.
May I quickly interject? And I think, yes, I mean, it's also like largely about the marginalization of the artist that takes place throughout the 90s, compared to the, you know, like the vulgar kind of socialist realist understanding of the artist as the engineer of social consciousness and of tastes that comes with Stalinism and has its reverberations later on. I have this like example of a Soviet cartoon about a lion who is playing in a circus, and then the lion goes to a holiday in Africa to visit his grandmother, but ends up playing circus tricks for the children in the village. So there's this understanding that the artistic labor is non-alienated labor, and going on holiday doesn't mean lying on the beach, eating a banana and so on, but conducting the job you are conducting because it gives pleasure to the audiences, right? So there's a shift from that kind of understanding of the artist, someone who bridges between, let's say, the contemplative life of the mind or artistic labor and social labor and the active life of the citizen, to the marginalization of the artist that takes place in the 90s. For instance, in Armenia, the contemporary artist would be someone who would be associated with some kind of a sect, right? In the social consciousness. Artists are weird, they hang out together, they eat and drink together, they are bohemian, they are strange. So from a general popular perspective, an artist would be like a weird person, akin to a sect. So there is a certain social marginalization that comes with the transition, let's say, from state-funded cultural sector to privately sponsored or NGO-funded contemporary art. That's the price that the artist pays. And I think what Octavian has been trying to tackle in the book is precisely that it's not the artists that would choose this or that topic and can be radical or less radical, right? But it's about the understanding of the political that is no longer possible in terms of like grand revolutionary projects or grand projects of mass transformation. Rather, we have kind of micro politics of more like a Foucauldian, right? Kind of victory of the Foucauldian paradigm of micro politics and power and its exercises that can be performatively challenged or subverted or resisted. Yeah, so.
Thank you very much. Actually, time is running out, so it's really time for closing the webinar, and I would like to finish with two closing remarks. On the one hand, I would like to emphasize that it would be really exciting to follow the track that Karolina offered and to place the post-socialist state into this picture and to examine how post-socialist state or states contributed to the process of the rise of contemporary art across the whole post-socialist region. So I think, yeah, this introducing the state perspective besides the perspective of transnational actors such as the SCCA could be really exciting and promising for me. And the other is a more general takeaway from Octavian books. And I really liked in this book how you detached the SCCA network or its activities from the persona of George Soros. And I think it could really open a path towards an art historiography in which is not revolving purely around the heroic egos of curators or the heroic egos of artists, but rather tries to offer structural analysis of artistic production and curatorial production. So it could be a perspective that this volume can open up. And of course, this volume can open many other perspectives up. So I would like to encourage all of you to read this book, discuss this book, debate this book, and so on and so on. And I would like to thank for everyone for joining tonight or this morning, depending on the time zone for this webinar. And especially thanks for our speakers, for Karolina, Octavian, Sven, and Angela for their interventions and comments and questions. Thank you very much for everyone. And the recording will be available after the webinar online. So if you have friends or colleagues to share, please do it.
Thank you for the invitation.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, bye.